Popular imagination tends to picture medieval fortress life through the lens of the Great Feast, an image built around long tables groaning under roasted meat, flowing wine, and minstrels performing for a lord surrounded by loyal knights. And while such feasts certainly occurred on particular ceremonial occasions, this romanticized image obscures a far more consequential and considerably less glamorous reality governing daily life within any fortified stronghold, since the actual survival of a castle or walled city depended not on occasional displays of abundance, but on an unglamorous, endlessly demanding system of logistics dedicated to keeping hundreds or even thousands of people fed across months or years of potential isolation. And in this video, we will set aside the banquet hall entirely to examine the grinding, calculated work of resource management that determined whether a fortress could withstand a prolonged siege or would instead collapse from starvation long before any enemy managed to breach its walls. To understand why food logistics carried such extraordinary weight within fortress society, it helps to first appreciate the fundamental strategic calculation underlying nearly every siege conducted throughout the medieval period. Since attacking commanders frequently recognized that directly assaulting well-constructed fortifications often proved considerably more costly in both time and casualties than simply surrounding a stronghold and waiting for its defenders to exhaust their food supplies, meaning that the outcome of many conflicts depended less on the skill of soldiers wielding weapons and considerably more on the foresight of administrators who had spent months or years beforehand preparing their granaries, cellars, and storage chambers for exactly this eventuality. This calculation applied with particular force whenever attacking armies possessed sufficient resources of their own to sustain a prolonged encampment outside fortress walls, since maintaining a besieging force in the field for many months carried its own substantial logistical burden, requiring attacking commanders to weigh the ongoing cost of supplying their own troops against the anticipated timeline for exhausting the defenders' provisions, a calculation that frequently favored whichever side possessed the more disciplined and far-sighted system of resource management rather than simply favoring whichever army happened to be larger or better armed. The historical record demonstrates this dynamic repeatedly across numerous documented sieges, where fortresses defended by relatively modest garrisons managed to withstand attacking forces many times their size for extended periods simply through superior provisioning, while other strongholds possessing formidable defensive architecture and substantial garrisons nonetheless fell within a matter of weeks due to inadequate advance preparation, underscoring the extent to which the outcome of medieval siege warfare depended on decisions made long before the first arrow was ever loosed or the first siege engine assembled outside the walls. This recognition transformed food storage and preservation into a matter of genuine strategic importance rather than mere household management, and the officials responsible for overseeing a fortress's provisions, often holding titles such as steward or seneschal, occupied positions of considerable authority within the broader hierarchy of castle administration, since their competence in calculating consumption rates, managing storage conditions, and anticipating potential shortfalls could ultimately prove far more decisive to a fortress's survival than the martial prowess of the knights charged with its physical defense. The training and selection of these administrative officials reflected the genuine seriousness with which fortress owners approached the challenge of provisioning, and successful stewards typically possessed considerable numeracy and organizational skill, maintaining detailed written inventories, negotiating directly with regional merchants and agricultural tenants regarding the delivery of tribute and purchased supplies, and coordinating the labor of bakers, brewers, butchers, and other specialized food workers whose combined efforts kept the fortress community fed on a daily basis regardless of broader military circumstances. Steward responsible for provisioning frequently proved as consequential as the relationship between the lord and any military commander, since a lord's ultimate survival during a prolonged siege depended almost entirely on decisions the steward had made months or years earlier regarding exactly how much grain to stockpile, how many livestock to maintain, and how aggressively to pursue additional provisions during periods when such purchases remained possible, meaning that the most successful fortress lords typically maintained close and trusting working relationships with these essential administrative officials. Grain formed the absolute foundation of this entire provisioning system, since cereal crops including wheat, barley, oats, and rye provided the caloric density and storage stability that no other available food source could match. And successful fortress administrators worked continuously throughout the year to accumulate substantial grain reserves, drawing on tribute collected from surrounding agricultural lands, direct purchase from regional markets during periods of surplus, and the careful timing of harvest to ensure that storage facilities remained as full as possible heading into periods of heightened military tension when supply lines from the surrounding countryside might suddenly become unreliable or entirely severed. The relationship between a fortress and its surrounding agricultural hinterland proved absolutely essential to this entire provisioning strategy, since most substantial strongholds depended on a network of tenant farms and estates obligated to deliver a portion of their annual harvest directly to the fortress as a form of tribute or rent, and maintaining productive, well-managed agricultural relationships across the surrounding countryside during peacetime directly determined how substantial a fortress's grain reserves could realistically become before the onset of any conflict that might disrupt these normal supply arrangements. Different grain varieties served somewhat different purposes within this broader provisioning strategy, since wheat, generally considered the most desirable grain for producing fine bread, commanded higher prices and was frequently reserved disproportionately for higher status consumption, while barley and oats, though less prized for direct human consumption, played essential roles both in animal fodder and in brewing operations, meaning that a well-managed fortress typically maintained a carefully balanced portfolio of different grain types rather than relying on any single crop to meet the community's full range of nutritional and practical needs. The physical infrastructure required to store this grain safely across extended periods represented a substantial engineering achievement in its own right, and many fortresses incorporated deep, carefully constructed subterranean chambers specifically designed to maintain the cool, dry conditions necessary to prevent grain from spoiling through moisture damage, insect infestation, or fungal growth. With some of the most sophisticated storage facilities incorporating ventilation shafts, moisture barriers constructed from clay or stone, and elevated flooring designed to keep stored grains separated from ground moisture that might otherwise seep upward and ruin an entire season's carefully accumulated reserve. The construction of these storage facilities typically required specialized masons and engineers familiar with the particular challenges of underground construction, and the resulting chambers often represented some of the most technically sophisticated architecture found anywhere within a fortress complex, incorporating carefully calculated drainage systems intended to channel away any moisture that might penetrate the surrounding earth, along with access passages designed to allow controlled ventilation while simultaneously limiting the entry of pests and preventing sudden temperature fluctuations that could accelerate spoilage of the stored grain. Some of the largest and most strategically significant fortresses maintained multiple separate grain storage facilities distributed across different sections of the complex, a deliberate redundancy intended to protect against the catastrophic loss that might result from a single storage chamber becoming compromised through structural failure, fire, or successful sabotage, ensuring that even significant damage to one storage location would not necessarily threaten the fortress's entire food supply and thereby providing an additional layer of resilience within the broader provisioning system. Beyond simple storage, the preservation of grain required constant vigilant management throughout the year, since stored cereals remained vulnerable to a range of threats, including rodent infestation, which fortress administrators combated through a combination of cat populations deliberately maintained within storage areas, carefully sealed storage vessels, and regular inspection routines designed to catch signs of infestation before they could spread throughout an entire granary. A set of ongoing maintenance tasks that, while unglamorous, proved every bit as essential to a fortress's ultimate survival as the physical maintenance of its defensive walls and towers. Alongside grain, the preservation of animal protein presented an entirely distinct set of logistical challenges, since fresh meat spoiled rapidly under most storage conditions available during the medieval period, and fortress communities therefore relied heavily on salt curing as the primary method for converting perishable livestock into stable, long-lasting provisions capable of surviving extended storage without refrigeration, a preservation technique that required substantial quantities of salt, itself a valuable commodity that needed to be acquired, transported, and stored in sufficient quantity to support the community's ongoing preservation needs throughout the year. Securing an adequate and reliable supply of salt represented a significant logistical undertaking in its own right, since salt production remained geographically concentrated around particular coastal evaporation sites and inland salt springs or mines, meaning that many fortress communities located at considerable distance from these production centers needed to establish and maintain reliable trade relationships capable of delivering sufficient salt throughout the year and any disruption to these salt supply networks, whether through military conflict, natural disaster, or simple commercial disputes, could seriously undermine a fortress's broader capacity to preserve meat for extended storage. The particular techniques employed for salt curing varied somewhat according to regional tradition and the specific type of meat being preserved, though most methods involved some combination of dry salting, in which meat was packed directly in salt or a salt and saltpeter mixture for a period of weeks, and wet brining, involving submersion in a concentrated salt solution. Both approaches drawing moisture out of the meat, while simultaneously creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that would otherwise cause spoilage, and many fortress kitchens supplemented this salt curing process with additional smoking. Exposing meat to prolonged low-temperature wood smoke that further inhibited bacterial growth while imparting distinctive flavor. The process of salt curing meat for fortress storage typically began with the systematic slaughter of livestock during the autumn months, a practice driven partly by the practical difficulty of maintaining large animal herds through the winter when fodder became scarce. And this seasonal slaughter produced a concentrated surge of fresh meat that needed to be rapidly processed into salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved form before spoilage could set in, requiring fortress kitchens and smokehouses to operate at maximum capacity during a relatively narrow seasonal window each year. Pork emerged as a particularly favored source of preserved protein within many fortress communities, since pigs required relatively modest resources to raise compared to cattle, while producing meat that responded especially well to salt curing and smoking techniques, and the resulting preserved products, including salted bacon and various forms of cured ham, could remain edible for many months when stored properly, providing a reliable source of protein capable of sustaining a garrison through extended periods when fresh food supplies from the surrounding countryside had become entirely unavailable due to siege conditions or seasonal scarcity. Fish, too, played a significant role within many fortress provisioning systems, particularly for coastal or riverine strongholds with reliable access to fishing grounds, and salted or smoked fish offered similar preservation advantages to cured meat while also serving an important religious function. Since medieval Christian dietary restrictions required abstention from meat on numerous designated fasting days throughout the year, making preserved fish an essential dietary staple capable of satisfying both nutritional needs and religious obligations simultaneously. The storage of these preserved proteins required its own specialized infrastructure, typically involving deep cellars or specially constructed larders positioned to take advantage of naturally cool temperatures, and larger fortresses often maintained extensive underground storage networks specifically organized to separate different categories of preserved food according to their particular storage requirements, ensuring that salted meats, which required relatively dry conditions to prevent spoilage, remained separated from other provisions that might introduce excess moisture into the storage environment. Water supply represented perhaps the single most critical vulnerability facing any fortress preparing for potential siege, since even the most extensive grain and meat reserves would prove entirely useless without a reliable source of drinking water capable of sustaining the garrison throughout an extended blockade. And fortress builders therefore devoted enormous engineering effort toward ensuring reliable water access, frequently constructing deep wells excavated directly through solid bedrock to reach underground water sources that would remain accessible regardless of whether besieging forces managed to cut off external water supplies from surrounding rivers or streams. The excavation of these fortress wells often represented one of the most technically demanding and time-consuming construction projects undertaken during a stronghold's initial building phase, since reaching a reliable underground water source sometimes required digging through many meters of solid rock using little more than hand tools. And the strategic importance of securing this water access meant that fortress builders frequently prioritized well construction even above other elements of the defensive architecture, recognizing that a fortress with formidable walls but no reliable internal water source remained fundamentally vulnerable regardless of how imposing its physical defenses might otherwise appear. Protecting these wells from potential contamination or sabotage represented an ongoing security concern throughout a fortress's operational life, and administrators typically restricted access to primary water sources, maintained careful oversight regarding who could draw water and when, and remained alert to any signs that an enemy might attempt to poison or otherwise compromise the water supply during periods of active conflict. Security measures that reflected the genuine catastrophic consequences that would follow any successful attack on a fortress's water infrastructure. Where reliable well access proved impossible due to underlying geology, fortress administrators developed alternative water management strategies, including extensive systems of cisterns designed to capture and store rainwater collected from rooftops and courtyards throughout the wetter months of the year, a storage approach that required careful maintenance to prevent contamination and that generally proved less reliable than a properly functioning well, since cistern-dependent fortresses remained vulnerable to prolonged drought conditions that could deplete stored reserves regardless of any external military threat. The brewing of ale and beer occupied a surprisingly central position within fortress food culture, driven partly by genuine culinary preference, but also by a widespread and largely accurate understanding that the brewing process, involving boiling water as part of fermentation, produced a beverage considerably safer to consume than water drawn from potentially contaminated sources. And fortress communities, therefore, maintained substantial brewing operations capable of producing the considerable daily quantities of ale that garrison members, including women and children residing within fortress walls, consumed as their primary daily beverage rather than relying on water alone. The scale of ale consumption within a typical fortress community proved genuinely substantial by modern standards, with historical records suggesting that individual daily consumption often reached multiple liters per person across the entire population, meaning that the brewing operation required to sustain an entire garrison and its associated civilian residents represented a continuous, large-scale industrial process rather than the occasional small-batch brewing that might be more easily imagined, requiring dedicated brewing facilities, substantial equipment, and skilled brewers capable of maintaining consistent production throughout the year. The brewing process itself required careful management of numerous variables including temperature, fermentation time, and the particular combination of grains employed, and successful fortress brewers developed considerable specialized expertise passed down through years of practical experience, since inconsistent or poorly managed brewing could produce ale that spoiled rapidly or proved genuinely unpalatable, outcomes that carried real consequences for a community that depended on this beverage as a primary daily source of hydration rather than viewing it as merely an occasional indulgence. This sustained demand for ale required its own dedicated resource inputs, particularly barley and other cereal grains that competed directly with the grain reserves being maintained for basic food consumption, forcing fortress administrators to carefully balance the allocation of available grain stores between direct food consumption and the ongoing brewing operations necessary to supply the community's daily beverage needs, a resource allocation decision that carried particular weight during periods of anticipated siege, when every measure of grain diverted toward brewing represented grain that would not be available for baking bread later in the conflict. Livestock management within fortress walls introduced further layers of logistical complexity, since maintaining live animals capable of providing fresh meat, milk, and eggs throughout an extended siege offered clear nutritional benefits, but simultaneously required dedicated space, fodder, and water that competed directly with the needs of the human garrison, forcing fortress administrators to make careful calculations regarding exactly how many animals could reasonably be maintained within the confined space of fortress walls without depleting resources that might otherwise support the human population for a longer period. These calculations grew increasingly urgent as a siege progressed, since fortress administrators frequently faced difficult decisions regarding when to begin systematically slaughtering remaining livestock rather than continuing to feed animals whose ongoing maintenance consumed increasingly scarce fodder and water resources. A decision that required balancing the immediate nutritional benefit of fresh meat against the longer-term strategic value of maintaining breeding stock capable of eventually restoring normal agricultural production once the siege had ended, assuming the fortress managed to survive long enough for that eventuality to matter. Bread production formed the daily backbone of fortress food culture, and most substantial fortresses maintained dedicated bakehouses capable of processing stored grain into the bread that constituted the primary staple food for the vast majority of residents. With these bakehouses typically operating according to carefully managed schedules designed to maximize fuel efficiency while ensuring a steady, predictable supply of bread sufficient to meet the daily needs of the entire garrison and civilian population sheltering within the walls. The construction and operation of these fortress bakehouses required careful attention to fire safety, given the considerable risk that any uncontrolled fire posed within a densely built fortress complex. And successful bakehouses typically operated within specially constructed stone chambers positioned away from other structures, incorporating substantial ovens capable of maintaining the sustained high temperatures necessary for efficient bread production while minimizing the risk that sparks or embers might escape to threaten the broader fortress community. The quality and composition of bread produced within these fortress bakehouses varied considerably according to social position, establishing one of the clearest and most immediately visible manifestations of hierarchy governing daily fortress life, since the finest, whitest bread produced from carefully sifted flour was typically reserved for the lord and highest-ranking members of the household, while coarser, darker bread containing unsifted flour and often supplemented with less desirable grains served as the standard fare for common soldiers, servants, and laborers residing within the same fortified walls. This graduated system of bread quality typically extended across several distinct tiers rather than a simple binary distinction between fine and coarse, with intermediate grades of bread serving various middle-ranking household officials, skilled craftsmen, and senior soldiers, creating a finely calibrated hierarchy in which an individual's precise social position could be inferred simply by observing the particular type of bread placed before them at any communal meal, a system of distinction so thoroughly embedded within daily practice that it required no explicit announcement or enforcement to remain consistently understood and observed by the entire community. This hierarchical distribution extended well beyond bread alone, encompassing nearly every category of food available within fortress society, and the particular cuts of meat, quality of ale, and access to preserved delicacies including dried fruit, spices, or imported goods all followed carefully maintained social gradations that reinforced existing power structures through the daily, unavoidable experience of eating, meaning that food distribution functions simultaneously as basic nutritional necessity and as a constant, visible reminder of each individual's precise position within the broader social hierarchy governing fortress life. Spices and imported delicacies occupied a particularly significant symbolic position within this hierarchical system, since substances including pepper, cinnamon, and other exotic seasonings arrived through long and expensive trade networks connecting fortress communities to distant markets, making their possession and consumption a powerful visible signal of wealth and status reserved almost exclusively for the lord's own table, and the deliberate display of such rare and costly ingredients during ceremonial feasts served important political functions, allowing a lord to demonstrate both personal wealth and continued access to functioning trade networks even during periods of broader regional instability. The considerable expense associated with these imported spices meant that their use within fortress kitchens remained carefully controlled, typically restricted to particularly significant ceremonial occasions rather than incorporated into ordinary daily meals, even for the lord's own household. And the specific quantity and variety of spices employed during a given feast could itself communicate important information to observant guests regarding the host's current wealth, ambitions, and standing relative to other regional powers, transforming what might appear to be simple culinary choices into carefully calculated political statements. Beyond spices, other imported delicacies including dried fruits, sugar, and fine wines from distant wine-producing regions likewise served this same symbolic function, and successful fortress lords worked to maintain reliable trading relationships capable of supplying these prestige goods even during periods of regional conflict. Recognizing that the ability to continue offering such refined hospitality despite surrounding turmoil represented an important demonstration of resilience and continued authority that could meaningfully influence how allies, rivals, and potential enemies alike perceive the fortress's overall strength and stability. As a siege progressed and stored provisions gradually diminished, the strict hierarchical distinctions governing normal fortress food distribution frequently became even more pronounced rather than dissolving under shared hardship, since fortress administrators generally prioritized maintaining adequate nutrition for the fighting garrison, whose continued physical capability remained essential to the fortress's defense, often at the direct expense of civilian residents, servants, and other lower status individuals whose rations might be reduced considerably earlier and more severely as available supplies continued shrinking. This prioritization reflected a hard-headed strategic calculation rather than simple indifference toward civilian suffering, since fortress commanders recognized that maintaining an effective fighting force capable of defending the walls represented the fundamental precondition for the survival of the entire besieged population, meaning that any resources diverted away from the garrison risked compromising the fortress's basic defensive capability and potentially hastening a far more catastrophic outcome for everyone sheltering within the walls, including the very civilians whose rations had been reduced in service of this broader strategic priority. The specific mechanisms through which rationing was implemented and enforced varied considerably across different fortresses and historical periods, with some administrators establishing formal, publicly announced ration schedules specifying exact daily allowances for different categories of residents, while others managed the process more informally through direct control over food distribution points. And the degree of transparency surrounding these rationing decisions itself often influenced how willingly the broader population accepted the resulting hardship, since populations that understood and accepted the underlying strategic logic generally proved considerably more resilient than those left uncertain regarding why their circumstances had suddenly grown so much more difficult. This pattern of unequal rationing during extended sieges occasionally produced significant internal tension within besieged communities, as accounts from various historical sieges describe growing resentment among civilian populations forced to endure severe hunger while military garrisons maintained comparatively better provisioned rations, tensions that, in the most extreme and prolonged sieges, occasionally escalated into open conflict between different factions within the besieged population itself, adding an additional layer of internal instability to the already severe external military pressure facing fortress defenders. The psychological dimension of food scarcity during prolonged sieges deserves particular attention, since historical accounts consistently describe how the gradual depletion of stored provisions created mounting anxiety and declining morale among besieged populations well before actual starvation set in, meaning that fortress commanders needed to carefully manage not only the physical reality of remaining food stores, but also the psychological perception of scarcity among the broader population, occasionally resorting to deliberate deception regarding remaining supplies in order to maintain morale and discourage any consideration of surrender. Historical accounts describe various strategies employed by fortress commanders specifically intended to project an outward appearance of continued abundance even as internal supplies grew genuinely dangerously low, including ceremonial displays of remaining provisions positioned to appear more substantial than they truly were. Deliberately generous public rations distributed on particular occasions specifically calculated to reach the attention of enemy observers, and other forms of calculated deception intended to convince besieging forces that continued blockade would prove futile, thereby potentially encouraging an earlier withdrawal than the fortress's genuine remaining supplies might otherwise have justified. Some of the most desperate sieges throughout medieval history produced extraordinary and occasionally gruesome examples of dietary adaptation as conventional food sources became entirely exhausted, with besieged populations in the most severe circumstances documented as having consumed draft animals, household pets, leather goods softened through prolonged boiling, and in the very worst documented cases, resorted to consuming grass, tree bark, and other normally inedible plant material in a desperate effort to extend survival for even a few additional days while awaiting either relief from Allied forces or the eventual withdrawal of besieging armies. These documented instances of extreme dietary adaptation, while relatively rare compared to the far more common experience of sieges resolved through negotiated surrender well before conditions reached such catastrophic extremes, nonetheless illustrate the genuine physical limits that fortress provisioning systems ultimately faced. And the detailed accounts that survive from these most severe historical sieges continue to inform modern historical understanding regarding exactly how long a population could realistically survive once conventional food sources had been entirely exhausted, providing sobering context for evaluating the broader significance of the provisioning systems described throughout this examination. The strategic calculations governing exactly how long a fortress could realistically withstand a siege depended heavily on detailed administrative record-keeping regarding stored provisions, and surviving historical documents from various medieval fortresses reveal surprisingly sophisticated accounting practices, with stewards maintaining careful written records tracking exact quantities of grain, salted meat, ale, and other essential provisions, allowing garrison commanders to calculate with reasonable precision exactly how many days or weeks their current stores could sustain the population at various rationing levels. Information that directly informed strategic decisions regarding whether to hold firm and await relief or instead pursue negotiated surrender before starvation became truly catastrophic. These detailed provisioning records also served important purposes extending well beyond immediate siege planning, since accurate ongoing accounting allowed fortress administrators to identify and address problems including spoilage, theft, or unexpectedly high consumption rates well before they could develop into genuine crises. And the surviving fragments of these medieval administrative records that historians have managed to study continue to offer valuable insight into the day-to-day realities of fortress life, revealing details regarding diet, social hierarchy, and resource management that rarely survive within the more commonly studied chronicles and narrative histories describing the dramatic military events themselves. The comparative study of surviving provisioning records from different fortresses across various regions and historical periods has allowed modern historians to identify broader patterns in how medieval administrators approached these logistical challenges, revealing considerable regional variation in preferred grain types, preservation techniques, and rationing practices that reflected both differing local agricultural conditions and distinct cultural traditions surrounding food and hospitality. Even as the fundamental underlying challenge of sustaining a fortified population through potential isolation remained remarkably consistent across the many different regions and centuries in which fortified strongholds played a central role in regional conflict. This administrative sophistication extended to careful advance planning conducted well before any actual siege began, since experienced fortress commanders understood that waiting until an enemy force actually appeared outside the walls left far too little time to accumulate adequate provisions. And prudent administrators, therefore, maintained substantial standing reserves throughout periods of relative peace specifically calculated to support the garrison through a siege of anticipated duration, continuously replenishing and rotating these stores to prevent spoilage while ensuring that adequate reserves remained available should military tensions suddenly escalate with little advance warning. The ultimate fall of numerous historically significant fortresses throughout the medieval period can be traced directly back to failures within this system of resource management rather than any purely military defeat, since besieging commanders frequently achieved victory simply by patiently waiting for a fortress's carefully calculated provisions to run out. And historical records describing the surrender of various besieged strongholds repeatedly emphasize starvation and the complete exhaustion of food stores as the decisive factor forcing capitulation. even in cases where the fortress's physical defensive walls remained entirely intact and its garrison had suffered relatively few actual combat casualties throughout the entire siege. This recognition that logistics rather than direct military confrontation frequently determined the ultimate outcome of medieval conflicts fundamentally shaped broader military strategy throughout the period, encouraging attacking commanders to favor prolonged blockade over costly direct assault whenever circumstances permitted sufficient time and resources to sustain a besieging force for the months or occasionally years that starving out a well-provisioned fortress might realistically require. A strategic calculation that transformed food logistics from a mere background consideration into one of the central determining factors shaping the entire conduct of medieval warfare. Looking back across this entire system of fortress provisioning, from the careful subterranean storage of grain through the elaborate hierarchies governing daily bread distribution and the desperate improvisation that characterized the final stages of the most severe sieges, it becomes clear that the survival of any medieval stronghold depended fundamentally on unglamorous administrative competence rather than simply martial valor, and the stewards, bakers, brewers, and provisioning officials who manage these complex logistical systems deserve recognition alongside the knights and soldiers more commonly celebrated within popular historical memory as essential figures whose careful, sustained management of scarce resources ultimately determined whether a fortress would successfully withstand its enemies or collapse from hunger long before any wall was ever breached. If this examination of fortress logistics resonates with you, share your own thoughts in the comments about which aspect of medieval provisioning strikes you as most remarkable, whether the sophisticated engineering behind underground grain storage, the strict social hierarchies embedded within daily food distribution, or the desperate improvisation that characterized the most severe historical sieges. And in an upcoming video, we will continue exploring the hidden logistical systems that shaped medieval life, turning our attention toward the equally demanding challenge of supplying and maintaining the weapons and armor upon which fortress defense ultimately depended.